In April of the year 1066, a strange sight in the heavens caused panic and alarm throughout much of Europe. What we now know to have been Halley's Comet was then called a long-haired star, but the ignorant and terrified inhabitants of Europe thought they were witness to a divine portent, heralding disaster and cataclysmic changes in the affairs of men. This time, they were to be proved right. Within 6 months, 2 of the most powerful monarchs in Western Europe were to lie slain on the battlefield. A third had begun the blood-stained rise, which was to give him mastery of England, the richest nation in Western Europe. He was known in his own time as William the Great, but to future generations, he would be better known by another name, William the Conqueror. From about the year 800 AD, a new and terrifying force had begun to make itself felt across the face of Europe. Sallying out from their Scandinavian homelands, wave after wave of sea raiders, Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes, voyaged in their longships to carry fire and sword through the prosperous lands of the Western world. This was the age of the Vikings. At first, they came in search of booty, plunder, and slaves, and the fury of the Norsemen was a bitterly experienced horror to the peoples of Britain, France, and most of the civilized world. In about 917 AD, one such group of raiders, led by a giant Norwegian called Rolf the Ganger, had been exiled by their ruler, the King of Norway. Rolf and his lawlessness, it seems, exceeded even the Norsemen's generous standards of tolerance. Rolf and his men must have been a desperate crew indeed. They boarded their longships and headed along the English Channel until they reached the French coast at the mouth of the River Seine. Before them lay a fertile countryside, filled with farms, churches, and prosperous towns, a land made to be plundered. In a series of devastating raids, Rolf and his men penetrated to the very gates of Paris. Finally, the King of France, Charles the Simple, sought peace. In desperation, he offered Rolf the title of Count and all the lands which lay between the river Ypres and the sea. Rolf agreed, accepted Christianity, and the hand of the king's daughter in marriage. By doing so, he became the French king's uneasy vassal, and his followers and their families took possession of their new territory. The land of the Northmen had been born. Its name survives today as Normandy.
There's still a lot of debate over who exactly the Normans were, but when we're looking at this, we should consider what the Normans themselves thought. They saw themselves as a distinctly separate race, the gens Normanorum, they call themselves, the Norman people. They were a fierce people, an ambitious, restless people, yet with a love of order. Yet paradoxically, but perhaps not surprisingly considering their Viking ancestry, they were difficult to rule. Their ruler, whoever he was, had to have a strong hand and he could never relax.
During the next century, the new rulers of Normandy prospered. They became, for the most part, zealous Christians. The devastated towns, churches, and monasteries were rebuilt, and the Normans became all but French in speech and culture. But, scarcely concealed beneath this outward veneer, the Old Norse restlessness and love of adventure and battle remained. They had seen brutal times in the past, and even more horror lay in the future. It was into this fierce dynasty that the young William was born. The fact that he was illegitimate affected him psychologically throughout his life. However, illegitimacy carried no particular stigma in 11th century Normandy. His early childhood seems to have been spent in the obscurity of his unmarried mother's household. But at the age of about 6, he was propelled to the forefront of events. In 1034, after a lifetime spent fighting domestic and foreign enemies and governing his unruly duchy, William's father, Duke Robert of Normandy, suddenly announced his intention of going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Before leaving, he called together his leading nobles and made a remarkable announcement. By my faith, it is not my will to leave you without a lord. I have a little bastard here who will grow, if God pleases, to be a gallant man. This is why I conjure you, you by the duty you owe me, to revere him as your lord. There was nothing in Norman law or custom to prevent an illegitimate son from succeeding to the dukedom. And to make William's position more secure, Robert appointed a regency council of notables led by his brother, the Archbishop of Rouen. In this precaution at least, Robert's fears proved well-founded. In the summer of 1035, news reached Normandy that his father had died of a fever at Nicaea, in what is now Turkey. Not only had the Duke failed to set eyes upon the holy city, but his dreams of a peaceful succession for his infant son would soon be in ruins. The hereditary violence of the Normans was about to be reawakened. Within a few months of the news of Duke Robert's death, his brother, the Archbishop of Rouen, died. Without his strong hand to guide its government, Normandy was plunged into bloody anarchy. One by one, the trusted lieutenants in whose care Duke Robert had left the infant William met violent ends at the hands of plotters and rebels. Alan, Count of Brittany, was poisoned. The young Duke's guardian, Gilbert of Brome, and Thorold, his tutor, were both brutally assassinated. The tide of violence was to engulf William himself in a horrifying way. One night, as he slept alongside his seneschal, Osborne Crepon, in his castle at Ventreuil, a party of rebels under Roger of Montgomery forced their way in. Osborne was viciously hacked to death. But the little boy, unnoticed in the frenzy, cowered undiscovered amid the bloody sheets. Who can tell how the traumatic event must have affected the mind of an impressionable 6-year-old? Maybe it was the horror which was to shape his own behavior. During these terrible days, Normandy tasted all the horrors of a medieval land without effective leadership. Throughout the realm, anarchy descended as its nobility rampaged unchecked. But as he grew into manhood, gradually the tide of events turned in William's favor. Wisely, he was able to surround himself with an efficient team of trusted advisors. And after a great deal of bloodshed, he reestablished peace in Normandy. Duke William broke by iron the 2 arrogant heads, dismantled the ramparts of crime by victoriously capturing many castles, and this stopped for a long time the intestinal wars of our region. It was a battle worthy of memory for many centuries to come.
William, of course his name is William the Bastard. He was the son of the previous Duke of Normandy and a washerwoman who took his attention. Came to the duchy in 1035 after a very turbulent youth, several attempts to assassinate him by various factions in the Norman scene. Therefore, he was very much a pragmatic man, no-nonsense fellow, first to last.
During the fight to pacify his homeland, William had been noted for his generosity and lenient treatment of his enemies. But there were incidents which showed a darker side of his nature. Not surprisingly, it was his concern over his illegitimate birth which was to provide the spark. Once during the siege of Alençon, as William approached an enemy outpost, its defenders had hung from its walls as a protection against fire the hides of some newly slaughtered oxen. In a reference to William's illegitimate birth, they chanted derisively, "Hides, hides for the tanner." White with rage, the young Duke ordered his men to storm the outpost. Then the 32 survivors of the garrison were blinded, had their hands and feet struck off, and were catapulted over the walls into the besieged city as a grim warning to its defenders that they would suffer the same fate unless they surrendered, which they made haste to do. The ruthless side of the Duke's nature was to become even more apparent as the years went by. If his gains were to be secure, it was now time to think of marriage. His choice was made with political implications firmly to the forefront. He married Matilda, daughter of Count Baldwin of Flanders. No doubt their match was intended to help secure Normandy's northern borders. Remarkably for the age, and possibly reflecting his attitude towards illegitimacy, William appears to have remained faithful to Matilda for the rest of her life. She bore him a number of children, including 4 sons, 2 of whom, William and Henry, were to be kings of England. But it was not in the nature of either William or his subjects to remain for long at peace. Fighting continued with the duchy's neighbors, and in one such campaign in 1065, William was accompanied by a distinguished foreigner, Harold Godwinson, the second most powerful man in England after King Edward the Confessor. It was a visit which was to have the most profound implications for both men, and also for their countries.
There are a lot of ambiguities about William's claim to the English throne. He himself said that he had been promised it in 1051 by Edward the Confessor. But what is in fact not often realised is that the throne wasn't Edward's to offer. The English monarchy was elective, which meant that the successor was chosen by a council made up of the leading nobles and clergy. The most that Edward possibly offered William was some sort of vague assurances of goodwill. Now there are the same sort of problems regarding Harold's visit to Normandy in 1064 or 1065. We don't even know why he went there in the first place. One possibility is that he was sent as an emissary by Edward. What may have happened is that once in William's power, he was made to swear an oath giving his support to William's claim for the throne. But again, Harold was not in a position to make any such promise.
Whatever agreement William believed he had obtained from Harold, he was to be bitterly disillusioned. When news reached Normandy of Edward the Confessor's death on the 5th of January, 1066, William expected to be offered the throne of England. Imagine then his rage at the announcement of Harold Godwinson's coronation as King of England. All the contemporary accounts speak of William's rage, so terrible that none dared approach him. Motivated perhaps as much by injured pride and the affront to his prestige as by any other reason, William was set on vengeance. If he was not to have the throne by popular assent, he would have it by force. As the summer of 1066 approached, all the furious Norman energy was employed in preparing to invade England and submit William's claims to trial by battle.
The main source of troops for William's invasion came from the Norman nobility, who who had to supply him with men as part of the duty to their overlord. But he also recruited a significant number of mercenaries and volunteers from other places, notably France, Flanders and Brittany. These were drawn by hopes of land and booty. The main strength of the Norman army, based on the popular image of the Bayeux tapestry, has always been thought to be its cavalry. And this is certainly true to a point. They were the main striking force of William's army. But also important were the infantry. There were spearmen, bowmen and crossbowmen. And these latter had an important role to play in the Normans' preferred tactics of combined arms warfare. The infantry would soften up the enemy, and then the cavalry would be sent in for the kill. Norman preparations were on a vast scale. William is said to have built or collected together over 700 ships, a huge total for those times. And he was also active on the diplomatic front. For instance, he obtained the blessing of the Pope and was able to carry the papal banner at the head of his army. Now, this not only gave him some useful spiritual brownie points, it was also a useful safeguard at home. Any foreign enemies, of whom he had a large number, would hesitate to invade Normandy if they knew William had the Pope's backing.
William the Conqueror's army, which he was collecting in Normandy, ready to invade Britain, really comprised two main sections. First of all, there are those local Norman lords and magnates who owed him a certain amount of military service, possibly 40 days a year. He also applied for and received a great many mercenary applications from other knights and so forth who were at a loose end, and literally came along for the loot, if you might say. Not particularly on the side of William, but he was paying them, and he said there might well be rewards in Britain for them. So you have a lot of Bretons, you have other kinds of French knights as well, a few Germans even, who were in this very kind of polyglot army, although the basis of it was, of course, Normans, as you might suppose. Now, there are three sorts of soldiers. First of all, the knights, which we all think of from the Bayeux tapestry, with their kite-shaped shields, their chainmail hauberks, and their lances. They were possibly about a couple of thousand of those. Then there were the foot soldiers and the archers, maybe 7,500 or so between them. When we say archers, we are talking about the short bow, of course, not the long bow of later generations. This was a far less devastating weapon, but a useful fire instrument to have at your disposal. The men-at-arms were equipped much the same as the knights, but fought only on foot. Over in England, it was a different situation from that in Normandy. Whereas the Normans now used their horses to fight on, as well as to move them to the battlefield, over the Channel in England, we had the last of the Danish traditional type army organizations. Horses were very much used, yes, certainly, for the king and his thanes and his huscarls, but they were used only for mobility. They always dismounted to fight, as had done the Vikings and the Danes in the previous centuries. They had, of course, as by way of a separate weapon from what the Normans had, the feared battle axe. The great battle axes on the shield wall would be indeed a daunting thing to face at any time, whether on horseback or not. So the two armies which are going to meet at Hastings really represented two distinct types of military organization. William, the mounted knight, with his great charges up the hill at Senlac and so forth, he represented the future. The great age of the knight in armor was about to begin and would last for the next 250 years or so. On the other hand, Harold's army represented the last of the old Danish, Norse-type armies, which always fought on foot, using their horses to get them to the battlefield, and then dismounting to form the famous shield wall, and then fight it out with their battle axes.
William faced a formidable task in challenging the richest nation in Western Europe, led by one of its foremost soldiers. However, William was to be aided by events elsewhere, for he was not the only claimant to the English throne. In late September 1066, a powerful army led by King Harold Hardrada of Norway and Harold Godwinson's renegade brother Tostig landed in the north of England, defeated the local Saxon forces under Earls Edwin and Morcar, and occupied York. King Harold, who had been waiting on the south coast to meet the rumored Norman invasion, was forced to hasten north, to counter this new, unexpected threat. Fatally, he also gave permission for the southern fyrd, the militia, to stand down in order to bring in the harvest. Moving with great speed, the English king confronted his northern foes at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September and won a total victory. Hardrada and Tostig were killed, and scarcely pausing for breath, Harold and his household troops, the Huscarls, hurried south once again, for the terrifying news was out. The Norman invasion had begun. Sometime around September 27, the huge Norman armada of some 700 ships set sail from the estuary of the River Somme. Unopposed by the English fleet, they arrived off Pevensey early the following morning. The Norman forces disembarked unopposed and moved to occupy the easily defensible peninsula occupied by the town of Hastings, where the Norman army established its base camp. William did not want to risk marching on London while Harold remained undefeated. Instead, he ordered his men to devastate the surrounding countryside, rightly calculating that Harold would be stung into giving immediate battle. Harold wasted no time, arriving back in London on October 6th with the survivors of his Huscarls. The English king desperately gathered what men he could, and then, without waiting for reinforcements from the Midlands and the north, marched out to meet the Norman invader. Harold was also keenly aware that as well as being depleted in numbers, the bulk of his troops were distinctly inferior to most of William's men, especially the lightly armed and equipped fyrdsmen. The Saxons, therefore, took up a strong defensive position on Senlac Hill, where they barred the road to London and awaited the Norman onslaught.
And then Harold, in effect, said to William, "Come and get me. You want the kingdom? Here I am. Come and get me." Now, saying that, of course, he was, in effect, handing the initiative over to Duke William. The form the battle would actually take and its successive stages then would be dictated by the Normans rather than by the Anglo-Saxons. And indeed, several of the chroniclers of the time speak of the way the shield wall stood as if rooted into the ground. This was going to be a fine, stalwart fight to the death. The chances of winning the Battle of Hastings were fairly limited because William could choose the tune and make the Anglo-Saxons dance to it.
As his army formed up for battle early on the morning of October 14, 1066, William must have known that at the age of 38, he was facing the supreme test of his military career. It is sometimes forgotten that hitherto the Duke had fought in only 2 major pitched battles, and his reputation as a general, though adequate, did not compare with that of his opponent, Harold Godwinson. Furthermore, a defeat would have dire consequences, for even if William were to survive and get back home to Normandy, he would be discredited and prey once more to his domestic and French enemies. None of these doubts showed, however, in the pre-battle speech which the Duke made to his commanders. "It is now that your arms must prove your strength and courage. If you fight like men, you will gain victory, honor, and wealth. Otherwise, you will be covered with eternal ignominy. No road is open for retreat. On one side, armed men and a hostile and unknown country bar your passage. On the other, the sea and other armed men are opposed to your flight. The courage of a small number of warriors may easily overcome a greater number of men unskilled in fighting, above all, when the cause of justice is protected by divine aid. Let nothing stand in your way, and soon you will triumph." The battle opened with an attack on the English position by William's archers and crossbowmen. They made little impression, and a general assault by the remainder of William's infantry was met by a hail of slingshot, small axes, and javelins.
At Hastings, it was a combination of archers and these mounted warriors that finally defeated the shield wall of Harold and the Anglo-Saxons at Senlac. The Norman cavalry were heavily equipped with hauberks of mail, with long kite-shaped shields, with lance and sword. They rode superbly bred and trained war horses. These horses, unafraid of the noise of battle, were fighters in their own right. We have a description of William's own horse trampling on people at Hastings. The knights would ride knee to knee in a charge, put in groups of 3 or 4, and they had great tactical flexibility. The key weapon of the knight was the lance, deployed in a shock tactic. The knight would couch his lance under his arm, bring his shield up for protection, feet in long stirrups, high-backed saddle, and together a group of Normans would charge with a great shock impetus whenever they struck a static line of infantry. One contemporary, speaking about the Franks on the First Crusade, said, "The charge of the Normans is irresistible. It could bore its way through the walls of Babylon." The Norman knight was the tank of the 11th and 12th century.
With the battle deadlocked, William committed his cavalry, but, hindered by the sloping ground and the English shield wall, many knights and their chargers were hacked down by Harold's formidable axemen and could not penetrate the English line. And now, some of William's men, probably the Bretons on his left wing, broke and fled, and the panic began to spread to the rest of the Norman line. Some of the English ran forward in pursuit, and a rumor began to spread that William had been killed. It was a moment of crisis, but William was equal to the occasion. Pushing back his helmet from his face and roaring with the full strength of his powerful lungs, William, seized by one of his famous rages, cried out to his troops, "Look at me, all of you. I still live, and with God's help I will conquer. What folly has driven you to flight? If you flee, not one of you will escape death."
Well, up to this point, the battle had been going quite well for Harold. His men were still holding the ridge-top position, and had thrown back everything that William could send against them. Furthermore, the day was drawing on, and William was in the position whereby if he didn't win the battle by the end of the day, he wasn't going to win it at all. It was at this point that the Normans carried out the famous feigned retreats. There's been a lot of debate about these. Were they deliberate, or were they just accidents that William was able to take advantage of? Quite a large number of Harold's less disciplined troops charged down the slope in pursuit, were cut off and wiped out. But the battle was still not won. The best of Harold's men, including the famous Huscarls, his personal bodyguard, was still in position on the ridge-top, and the shield wall was still intact.
Aided by his half-brother, the fearsome mace-wielding Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, William rallied his men and cut down the pursuing Saxons. Though the immediate crisis was over, the battle was far from won.
By about midday, the Battle of Hastings had reached a rather parlous situation, perhaps for both sides. Harold had lost the whole right wing third, which had charged down and been then butchered by the Normans, who turned round, having deliberately lured them into a premature attack in that way. But as far as the Normans were concerned, although that was obviously a plus, yet the battle was yet far from won, and it was absolutely necessary that a decision should be reached within that day before sunset. They had nowhere to fall back upon. Their morale would plummet if they didn't win the battle on this first day, and they would probably face, therefore, total disaster. Therefore, the battle is not yet won, but every incentive is now for William to fling all his remaining resources into this battle. The Anglo-Saxon line was battered. It had no right flank now, but still there was this formidable line of the shield wall with their battle axes waving threateningly over the top of it, and so everything was yet to be gained or lost.
William at this point changed his tactics. He ordered his archers to advance and fire a barrage of arrows at close range. Now these really began to tear gaps in the English line. It was probably at this point that Harold was struck down, quite likely by the famous arrow in the eye, which is now normally accepted as probably being an authentic incident. His brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, were already dead, and as a result the English command structure started to break down and morale began to crack. As gaps appeared in the line, the Norman cavalry were unleashed, forced their way through and began to hack down the isolated groups of Englishmen. It was also probably at this point that the mortally wounded Harold was finished off.
With King Harold lying dead at the foot of his standard, William had won his greatest victory. Whatever his skills as a general, it is clear that the Duke had been an inspiring leader of his men in battle.
It was always customary for medieval chroniclers to magnify the role of leaders in battle, but William seems to have carried out both of the roles expected of him with great success. He was in the thick of the fighting, inspiring his men, and yet he also was able to keep control of his army overall and direct their operations in a coherent fashion. It's true to say that without William, the Normans would not have won the Battle of Hastings.
Harold was dead, Duke William clearly triumphant and de facto King of England. Trial by battle, as religious men regarded it at the time, had now decided once and for all the question of the succession to Edward the Confessor. The whole future, indeed, of these islands was going to be irremediably affected by the outcome of this battle, which must be certainly one of the most significant moments in the history of these islands.
William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. It was noted that William was visibly trembling. If so, it was one of the few occasions in his life when he apparently showed fear. That fear may have been apprehension, because William was well aware that his conquest of England had only just begun. Even though many of the leading magnates had submitted, the English people, for the most part, remained defiant. If they had glimpsed the full horror of what was to follow, they may well have chosen not to resist the Norman invader. At first, all was relatively civilized. The new king made a brief progress through the territory under his control, and with characteristic thoroughness, set his men to work to extend and consolidate their gains.
Following 1066, William's task was clear. He somehow had to rivet Norman control on a country that was in a state of political flux. He also had to watch his back in Normandy, and one of the first things he does in 1067 is to go on a triumphal progress back to the duchy, leaving key lieutenants in charge of castles such as Dover, Hastings, Pevensey. But he takes with him the leading Anglo-Saxon magnates virtually as political hostages. And we have an account from a Norman chronicler who says that in Rouen, the Normans marveled to see these prisoners brought with their long hair, their wonderful clothes, fabulously adorned filigree work of their Saxon ornaments. This was a triumphal progress. But William couldn't remain in Normandy very long. He distributed gifts, made sure that his control of the duchy was secure against his French enemies, against the Count of Anjou, the King of France, Count of Flanders, and then quickly returned to re-establish his authority.
The Normans in England were few in numbers, perhaps no more than 10,000 in all, and so depended upon a network of castles to overawe and control the conquered English. Many of these structures still scatter the English landscape today.
What the Normans did, they would build a castle, often by requisitioned Saxon labour. Some deep irony there that the Saxons are forced to build the very mechanisms of their own oppression. But from that, they used the castles as a springboard for further conquest. They would build a castle within, let's say, 15 miles of the next one, the operating radius of horsemen in a day's ride. And then from that castle, they would take a further area of territory, consolidate with the castle, and move on. By the death of William the Conqueror in 1087, England was literally studded with castles. Probably by the year 1100, there are over 1,000 modern bailey castles in Britain.
The promises which William had made to respect English rights and laws were quickly forgotten. Those who had fought at Hastings and the families of those slain had their lands confiscated or had to make heavy payments in gold to the Norman victors. It seems clear that William himself was as guilty of abuse as any of his followers. His greed for gold was proverbial, especially among the conquered English. To the Norman barons, whose rapacious Viking ancestry was still very much in their blood, the riches of England presented a temptation impossible to resist. They were a restless, drunken, and emotional society, dazzled with the prospect of unaccustomed wealth. William, at least initially, seems to have succumbed along with the rest. And as well as greed, he was now to gain a steadily growing reputation for ruthlessness. Not surprisingly, the next few years saw a flood of uprisings against the rule of the hated Normans. One such rebellion took on a serious new dimension in January 1069, when William's new overlord in the north was surprised at Durham and slaughtered along with 900 Normans. This was a major disaster for the Normans. Of even more concern was a new wave of insurrection throughout the country. William's hold on England seemed to be hanging by a thread, but he responded with a ferocity which has echoed down the ages. Striking first at Edric the Wild's rebels in the Midlands, William then led his troops north in a savage and whirlwind campaign. King William was determined to break the power of the North once and for all. In order to do this, he was prepared to use the most brutal methods.
In 1069, William the Conqueror faced the greatest threat to his rule so far, a coalition of the King of Scots, the King of Denmark, who sent a fleet which entered the Ouse estuary, a rising of the Northern Earls, outbreaks in Wales and the South Countries. William's response was short and brutal. His army entered Yorkshire, laying waste, killing and burning whatever he could find. Crops were garnered together and systematically burnt. Ploughs, instruments of agricultural production were destroyed in order to create an artificial famine. Those who escaped the Norman swords died of slow starvation. The chronicler records that the streets and houses lay empty, the fields littered with bodies, and there was no one left alive to bury them.
It has been estimated that the ravaging of the North, which extended across the counties of Yorkshire, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, Cheshire, and Shropshire, cost the lives of between 5 and 10% of the total population of England, and caused a devastation whose effects were still visible 60 years later. Despite the horrors, the period after the conquest saw a great resurgence in religious activity in England. For example, building work went on great cathedrals like Durham, Canterbury, and Gloucester, and the monasteries flourished, a kind of uneasy peace settled on the land. Though stern beyond measure to those who opposed his will, William was kind to those good men who loved God. On the very spot where God granted him the conquest of England, he caused a great abbey to be built, and he settled monks in it, and richly endowed it. During his reign was built the great cathedral at Canterbury, and many another throughout all England. The land was filled with monks living their lives after the rule of St. Benedict. Such was the state of religion in his time that every man who wished to, whatever considerations there might have been with regard to their rank, could follow the profession of monk. William had made the English church administratively efficient, but he had also made it Norman. In their spiritual lives, as in every other aspect of their existence, the English people was subject to their foreign overlords. William also established his rule of law over England and made a rudimentary use of what was later to become the jury system. But once again, it was a justice very much designed to protect the position of the conquerors. It was said that in William's reign, any man might travel over the kingdom with a bosom full of gold, unmolested. But anyone fortunate enough to have possessed such wealth would undoubtedly have been speaking Norman French. In 1080, a threat of renewed Danish invasion and the need to pay large numbers of continental mercenaries drew attention to the lack of any accurate record of the wealth of England and who exactly held its lands. This was a situation which William, with his avarice and energy, could not allow to continue. At Christmas, 1085, grown, we are told, immensely fat, and with a harsh, commanding voice, William called his council together and decided what to do. The result was to be the Great Survey, later called with wry humor by the English, the Doomsday Book. It was the most thorough land survey which had ever been carried out, and it was done with amazing speed and efficiency. King William sent his men all over England, into every shire, to ascertain how many hundreds of hides of land there were in each shire, and how much land and livestock the king himself owned in the country, and what annual dues were lawfully his from each shire. He also had it recorded how much land his archbishops had, and his diocesan bishops, his abbots, and his earls, and what or how much each man who was a landholder here in England had in land and livestock, and how much money it was worth. So very thoroughly did he have the inquiry carried out that there was not a single hide, nor one vergate, not even, it is shameful to record it, but it did not seem harmful to him to do it, one ox or one cow or pig, which escaped his survey. As William grew older, his relationship with his eldest son, Robert, had deteriorated. Robert had been named as William's heir for the dukedom of Normandy, and as the years went by, he grew impatient to take up his inheritance. William was dismissive of his son's demands, remarking, "It is not my custom to take off my clothes before I go to bed." In the summer of 1086, reports reached King William that Robert was plotting with King Philip of France to invade Normandy. And though now almost 60 years of age, immensely stout, and in deteriorating health, William crossed to the duchy to meet this new threat. At the end of July 1087, William's troops stormed the city of Nantes and put it to the torch. Riding exultantly through the burning streets, William was either struck by a seizure in the immense heat, or was thrown by his stumbling mount with great force against the iron pommel of his saddle. He suffered a fatal internal injury. The dying king was carried back to Rouen, where he lingered in great pain for 6 weeks. William sensed the end was near, and with typical pragmatism, began settling his affairs. William, with great reluctance, confirmed his errant son Robert in his longed-for Normandy. His second son, William Rufus, was to become King of England. In his 60 years, William had risen from obscurity, secured his dukedom against internal and external foes, and conquered the richest land in Western Europe, bringing to it a harsh and ordered government, such as it had never previously known. But now, William was at last faced by death, the greatest foe of all, and one whom even he could not defeat. On the morning of September 9th, 1087, as the great bell of the Minster of Rouen tolled, the fierce old warrior breathed his last. A monk from William's own abbey, though writing 200 years later, has left an account of the Conqueror's tormented words of guilt and anguish, which may well serve as his most fitting epitaph, especially in the eyes of his English subjects. I persecuted the native inhabitants of England beyond all reason. Whether nobles or commons, I cruelly oppressed them. Many I unjustly disinherited. Innumerable multitudes, especially in the county of York, perished through me by famine and sword. I tremble when I reflect on the grievous sins which burden my conscience. And now, about to be summoned before the most awful tribunal of God, I know not what I ought to do. I was bred to arms from my childhood, and am stained with the rivers of blood that I have shed.